On 9th May 2015, Russia staged its largest Victory Day parade in decades through Red Square, showcasing a rebuilt military meant to project the image of a fully modernized, technologically confident armed forces 70 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Within hours, that image cracked in front of a global television audience when the newly unveiled T-14 Armata, the supposed centerpiece of the entire parade, stalled and had to be towed away in full view of foreign journalists and military attachés during the final rehearsal. This episode traces how Russian designers built the Armata platform to leapfrog 3 generations of tank development at once, and why a single embarrassing breakdown on its very first public appearance became the defining image of a program that promised more than it could immediately deliver. That single stalled engine, broadcast to television audiences in dozens of countries before military correspondents had even finished their pre-parade commentary, would color foreign assessments of the entire program for years afterward, regardless of what genuine engineering advances sat underneath the embarrassment. Russian tank design, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had spent 2 decades in a kind of institutional holding pattern, refining T-72 and T-90 derivatives rather than fielding a genuinely new base design, largely because the chaotic 1990s left Russian defense industry starved of the investment a clean-sheet tank program required. The T-80, a gas turbine-powered contemporary of the late Soviet T-72 lineage, had briefly offered an alternative technical path in the 1970s and 1980s, favored by some planners for its rapid acceleration and cold-weather starting reliability, but its thirsty turbine engine and high production cost meant it never fully displaced the diesel-powered T-72 and T-90 family as the mainstream choice, and post-Soviet Russia largely abandoned new T-80 production entirely by the mid-1990s, in favor of the cheaper, more established diesel lineage. By the early 2000s, Russian military planners had grown increasingly concerned that incremental upgrades to a Cold War-era hull could only go so far against NATO's own third-generation tanks, whose composite armor and digital fire control had matured steadily through decades of sustained Western investment. The answer, once funding finally became available under a broader military modernization drive beginning around 2010, was not another upgrade to the T-90, but an entirely new platform called Armata, intended from the outset to serve as a common chassis for tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and support variants alike, a level of ambition no single post-Soviet Russian design bureau had previously attempted. An engineer involved in the program's early design phase described the scale of the undertaking plainly. "We were not being asked to improve a tank. We were being asked to reinvent what a Russian tank even was." That reinvention was not purely a matter of internal Russian ambition. It also reflected a genuine institutional debate about doctrine that echoed arguments Soviet planners had fought through decades earlier over the T-64 and T-72 split, now replayed in a modern context. Some planners argued Russia should simply continue refining the T-90 lineage indefinitely, accepting incremental gains as the realistic ceiling for a defense industry still recovering from the 1990s, while others insisted that only a genuine clean-sheet design could restore Russian tank technology to rough parity with NATO's third-generation vehicles within a single generation rather than several. The Armata program's backers ultimately won that argument, securing funding under the broader state armament program adopted in 2010, which committed substantial resources to modernizing the Russian military across all branches through the following decade. The central technical leap was an unmanned turret, with the entire 3-man crew relocated into a heavily armored capsule in the hull front, physically isolated from the ammunition and gun above them, for the first time in Russian tank history. Soviet and Russian tanks going back to the T-64 had always accepted the carousel autoloader's catastrophic vulnerability as an unavoidable cost of a lighter, smaller crew. Armata's designers explicitly set out to eliminate that trade-off entirely, rather than manage around it, a doctrinal statement as much as an engineering one, declaring that crew survivability, not just vehicle weight, deserved to be engineered for directly. Whether that isolated crew capsule and its reliance on remote sensors and displays, rather than direct vision, could actually deliver on its promise, remained, at the time of its unveiling, a matter Western analysts still debated, since no Armata had yet been tested in sustained combat conditions. That uncertainty sat inside a much larger and more consequential institutional gap. Western tank programs through the 2000s and 2010s continued incremental but well-funded upgrades to existing third-generation designs, the American Abrams and German Leopard 2 both receiving new armor packages, active protection systems, and digital fire control on a rolling basis, backed by stable, predictable NATO defense budgets that rarely faced the kind of sudden multi-year funding collapse Russian programs periodically endured. Those Western upgrade programs deliberately avoided the all-or-nothing gamble Armata represented, spreading technological risk across smaller, more frequent increments, precisely because stable funding allowed for that more cautious, iterative approach. Russia, by contrast, attempted its full generational leap in a single program, betting that Armata's advanced features would compensate for the smaller total defense budget available to fund it, a gamble that concentrated enormous institutional and financial risk into one project rather than spreading it across incremental steps. Russian planners justified the approach by pointing to intelligence, gathered through open-source reporting and defense attaché channels, suggesting NATO members were themselves quietly developing next-generation tank concepts, creating pressure to field something equally advanced before falling permanently behind. Western defense analysts who monitored Russian procurement announcements through this period noted a recurring pattern. Ambitious unit numbers announced at international arms exhibitions rarely survived contact with the following year's actual budget, a gap between declared intent and delivered funding that grew more pronounced the further the decade progressed, and one that Russian officials rarely acknowledged publicly, even as trade journalists and foreign attachés quietly tracked the shrinking figures year over year. That pressure collided directly with Russia's actual industrial capacity when the wider Russian economy, strained by the falling oil prices and Western sanctions that followed the 2014 annexation of Crimea, forced repeated cuts to the planned production run, delaying the large-scale fielding that had originally been promised for the mid-2010s. Defense Ministry officials, speaking to state media through this period, continued publicly projecting confidence in the program's timeline, even as internal procurement documents, portions of which later became public through budget disclosures, revealed order quantities falling from an original target in the thousands to a few dozen initial production vehicles. It was against this backdrop of underfunded ambition that the parade rehearsal breakdown occurred, and the vehicles rolling toward Red Square that May morning were, in a very real sense, still prototypes being pushed into a symbolic role their production timeline had not yet caught up to. The lineage behind the Armata concept traces back most directly to the T-90, itself a further refined descendant of the T-72B design, which Russian factories had continued producing and upgrading through the 1990s, even as funding for anything more ambitious dried up almost entirely. The T-90, entering service in 1992, carried a crew of 3, a 125mm 2A46 MEM gun, capable of firing both conventional rounds and the 9M119 reflex-guided anti-tank missile through the barrel, and Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, giving it markedly better protection against both kinetic and shaped charge threats than earlier T-72 variants. Its diesel engine, in various upgraded forms, produced between 840 and 1,000 horsepower depending on the specific production batch, giving the tank a range near 550 kilometers and a top speed around 60 kilometers per hour. It solved the T-72 family's most glaring armor deficiencies through the addition of reactive armor blocks and improved fire control. But it remained fundamentally the same three-man carousel autoloader layout that had made earlier T-72 variants vulnerable to catastrophic ammunition explosions when penetrated. Export success gave the T-90 program financial breathing room that domestic Russian orders alone could not have provided during the lean 1990s and early 2000s, with India in particular licensing large-scale local production of the type, a revenue stream Russian planners later credited with keeping core tank engineering expertise and production infrastructure alive long enough to eventually support the far more ambitious Armata program. A Russian tank instructor who trained crews on early T-90 production recalled the persistent unease that vulnerability created, even in an otherwise improved design. You could add all the reactive armor blocks you wanted to the outside, but everyone still knew where the ammunition sat underneath the turret ring. Crews serving in early T-90 units also inherited the same cramped, physically demanding interior that had defined Soviet tank design since the T-72. One loader recalling training exercises where the reactive armor blocks bolted to the outside made the tank look tougher, but inside, nothing had actually gotten roomier. We were still folded into the same tight seats as our fathers had been. That knowledge, carried by an entire generation of Russian tank crews trained on a design whose fundamental vulnerability had never actually changed since the 1970s, planted the doctrinal seed for Armata's most radical departure a generation later. If the autoloader could not be made safe, the crew simply had to be moved somewhere. The autoloader's failure could not reach them. Successive T-90 subvariants through the 2000s, including the T-90A with an improved welded turret and thermal sights, and later the T-90M with a further upgraded 2A46M5 gun and additional modular armor, each pushed incremental improvements to protection and fire control without ever addressing that core structural vulnerability. Crews who transitioned onto the T-90A recalled a genuine improvement in night fighting capability, one gunner noting that, for the first time we could actually find a target in the dark before he found us. But the same crews continued training with the unspoken understanding that a solid penetrating hit to the turret ring still risked igniting every round stored below it. The T-90M's further upgraded fire control and reinforced turret armor pushed the design's protection close to the practical limit of what could be added to the original T-72 hull without fundamentally compromising the vehicle's weight and mobility balance. A ceiling engineers had been approaching for years and finally reached with this variant. That persistent, unaddressed weakness, more than any single external threat, is what finally justified the far more expensive and organizationally disruptive step of designing an entirely new hull and turret architecture from scratch, rather than continuing to patch the T-72 lineage indefinitely. Russian planners also drew directly on lessons from the brief 2008 war with Georgia, where Russian T-72 and T-90 crews suffered losses to modern anti-tank guided missiles supplied to Georgian forces, reinforcing the argument that incremental armor improvements alone could no longer keep pace with the anti-tank weapons increasingly available even to smaller, less well-funded militaries. A tank officer who reviewed after-action reports from that brief conflict recalled the sobering conclusions circulated among planners afterward. We had beaten a much smaller army and still lost vehicles to weapons a mid-sized state could simply buy off a shelf, which was not the lesson anyone wanted to draw, but was the correct one. That 2008 experience, brief as the war itself was, carried disproportionate institutional weight, precisely because it demonstrated the vulnerability gap in live combat rather than in a laboratory test, giving Armata's advocates within the Defense Ministry concrete battlefield evidence to cite when arguing for the program's much larger budget against competing claims on limited post-2008 military spending. The the T-14 Armata itself, unveiled publicly in 2015, though still in a limited pre-production status at that point, represents the culmination of that shift and stands as the definitive vehicle in this account. It carries a crew of 3, all seated together in the armored hull capsule, rather than distributed between hull and turret, as in every Russian tank before it, operating the unmanned turret's 125mm 282-1M smoothbore gun, a weapon capable of significantly higher chamber pressure and muzzle velocity than the T-90's 2A46M, alongside a coaxial machine gun and a remote-controlled anti-aircraft mount. Armor figures remain only partially disclosed by Russian sources, but the hull front is understood to combine composite layering with an add-on modular package intended to defeat modern tandem charge warheads, while the crew capsule itself is separately armored against exactly the autoloader detonation scenario that had haunted every T-72 and T-90 crew before it. The engine, a 12-cylinder diesel producing an estimated 1,500 horsepower, gives the roughly 55-ton vehicle a projected range near 500 kilometers and a top speed reported at around 80 kilometers per hour, figures that, if accurate, would make Armata both better protected and more mobile than the T-90 it is meant to eventually replace. Inside the hull capsule, crews describe an experience unlike any earlier Russian tank. No direct vision blocks or periscopes looking out over the gun, only a wraparound array of camera feeds and digital displays. A design a Russian crewman who trained on early production vehicles described with evident unease as fighting the whole battle through a screen, which feels strange the first dozen times, even if the picture itself is perfectly clear. That same crewman noted a psychological adjustment that had no real precedent in earlier Soviet or Russian tank training. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with the driver and gunner in a shared capsule, rather than the traditional split between hull and turret, meant the crew could talk normally without an intercom for the first time. A small comfort that nonetheless took getting used to after years of training on tanks, where the loader and gunner rarely saw each other's faces during an engagement, and where the isolation of the old turret arrangement had, in its own way, become such an ingrained part of Russian tank culture that its absence felt almost as strange to veteran instructors as the unfamiliar screens themselves. Maintenance crews servicing early Armata prototypes also reported a learning curve around the vehicle's extensive onboard electronics and sensor suite, systems considerably more complex than anything fielded on the T-90, requiring specialized diagnostic equipment that many existing Russian tank repair depots had not yet been supplied with by the time of the platform's public debut. That gap between the sophistication of the vehicle itself and the readiness of the wider maintenance and logistics network meant to support it in the field would remain, according to independent defense analysts tracking the program, one of the less publicized but more consequential obstacles standing between Armata's technical promise and its actual battlefield deployment in meaningful numbers. That unmanned turret design was still working through exactly this kind of crew adaptation, along with software and sensor reliability issues, when the rehearsal breakdown occurred on Red Square that May morning, an embarrassment Russian officials attributed publicly to a minor mechanical fault, but which Western analysts read as symptomatic of a program still not fully mature enough for the high-visibility debut it had been given. Video of the stall, showing the vehicle's engine cutting out mid-procession and a support crew rushing forward to tow it away in front of assembled dignitaries and cameras, circulated globally within hours, becoming shorthand in Western defense commentary for the gap between Russian military messaging and Russian military readiness, an association the program would spend years trying to shake, even as the underlying engineering work continued largely out of public view. Institutional consequences followed within the Russian Defense Ministry itself. Procurement targets originally set at several hundred vehicles for the mid-2010s were repeatedly scaled back and pushed further into the future, and full-rate serial production had still not been confirmed at meaningful volumes years after the platform's unveiling. a gap between announced ambition and delivered hardware that shadowed the program throughout its first decade. Officials associated with the program insisted privately that the technology itself remained sound and that funding, not engineering, was the limiting factor, a defense that outside observers found at least partially credible given how genuinely novel the unmanned turret concept was compared to anything else in a Russian tank crew's collective experience. Foreign military observers permitted limited access to later demonstrations, noted continued refinement of the platform's systems in subsequent years, suggesting the program's engineers had used the intervening time productively, even as headline production numbers remained modest by the standards of Cold War-era Soviet tank manufacturing. Assessed on its own terms, the T-14 Armata represents a genuinely significant conceptual leap in tank design, particularly its unmanned turret and isolated crew capsule, addressing a structural vulnerability that had persisted across Soviet and Russian tanks for half a century. Its stated specifications, including the higher pressure main gun, the improved projected top speed, and the electronic architecture supporting networked battlefield awareness, all point toward a vehicle designed with a genuinely different set of priorities than the incremental T-72 and T-90 lineage that preceded it. Whether those priorities translate into a genuine battlefield advantage remains a separate question from whether the underlying engineering concepts are sound, and the two should not be confused simply because one has been demonstrated on paper and the other has not yet been demonstrated in war. What it has lacked, at least through its first years of public existence, is the sustained combat testing and stable, well-funded production pipeline that would let outside observers judge whether its advanced features perform as designed under real battlefield conditions rather than on a parade ground or a proving range. Western military assessments through this period remain divided on how much weight to give the platform's theoretical capabilities against its clearly documented production and reliability struggles, a debate that could only be settled by data the program had not yet generated in any meaningful volume. The stalled vehicle, towed away from Red Square in 2015, remains the platform's most widely seen image, a reminder that even the most ambitious design leap still has to survive the unglamorous business of actually working the first time it matters.